FBI, freeze! Get down on the ground!
A family vanishes without a trace. Local authorities find no leads to the identity of their abductors. When stolen weapons began to surface, investigators realized the perpetrators were part of a nationwide rampage of violence. They were dangerous men who would stop at nothing to escape justice.
When a family was murdered in Arkansas, it seemed like an isolated event. But soon the crime was revealed to be part of an ever-widening circle of violence that defined a new age of domestic terrorism. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. For the killers, the triple homicide in Arkansas was simply a means to an end. They made their way across the country, letting nothing stand between them and their twisted mission. And we would stop at nothing to prevent their rampage.
January 1996. Tilly, Arkansas, a small rural neighborhood, was home to William Mueller. Mueller was a gun enthusiast and self-employed electrician. His wife Nancy homeschooled their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. Returning from a day of work, the Muellers were confronted by two men in their home.
Get in here, don't move! You got him? Hands behind your back! Hands behind your back, ma'am, now!
They were dressed as FBI agents, but they were imposters. They were after the large supply of weapons and cash that Mueller had in his home. When the 52-year-old Mueller refused to cooperate, the intruders separated the family and tortured them. Nancy Mueller's mother, Earlene Branch, grew concerned when she hadn't heard from her daughter in 2 weeks. She turned to the sheriff for help.
I usually hear from her at least.
She explained that the family often traveled to gun shows, yet her daughter always called when they returned.
This is unusual.
Although the Muellers lived in a neighboring county, the sheriff knew the family and agreed to look into the matter. He checked with local authorities and talked to Mueller's neighbors. Though Sheriff Jay Winters found no trace of the family, people who knew them weren't concerned.
For the most part, there wasn't a lot of fear. Most people thought, you know, maybe they had just gone off somewhere and wanted to be on their own for a while.
On February 11th, a month after their disappearance, a farmer found the Muellers' Jeep concealed and abandoned off the highway, miles from their home. Detective Aaron Duval from the Polk County Sheriff's Office was sent to investigate.
It was approximately 20 miles north of Russellville, off the State Highway 7, hid behind a brush pile. I was called out that day, went up there, took pictures of the vehicle and the trailer.
Inside the Jeep, Duval found Nancy Mueller's purse. It held her wallet and ID. The trailer, used by Bill Mueller to transport munitions to gun shows, was empty. Several more months passed, and the Muellers were still missing. 40 miles from Tilly, an elderly couple enjoyed a day of fishing in a bayou near Russellville. While waiting for a fish to bite, the woman snagged her line. She pulled up an old tennis shoe. A leg bone jutted out of it. Horrified, she cut it loose and went for help. Within hours, search teams combed the bayou organized by Sheriff Winters. They used large metal hooks to drag the bottom. Divers swam the depths. By day's end, parts of a single body were recovered, a murder victim.
The torso had a rock attached to it. There was a lot of tape on it. The head had a bag of some type on it, duct tape around the head. Very disturbing to us because it was obvious, you know, that this was a different type of thing than we typically deal with. It was an obvious execution. It was just some cold-hearted people.
Investigators determined it was the body of a small female. They thought it might have been a 6-year-old girl who had been abducted several counties away the previous year. When the clothing and size didn't match her description, another possibility became apparent. It could have been Sarah Mueller. The next day, 2 more partial bodies were found. All 3 torsos had been weighed down with rocks, and each head was covered with a plastic bag secured with duct tape. Dental records, DNA, and clothing confirmed the identity of the bodies. They were William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their daughter Sarah. The missing persons case was now a grisly triple homicide investigation.
It was bad for Bill and Nancy to have to die the way they did. But for a 7-year-old girl to die that way, to be wrapped with plastic, to be wrapped with duct tape, to have a 60-pound rock strapped to her body and thrown into a lake, there was no excuse.
During the autopsy, the coroner determined that the 3 had probably been in the water since January 11th, the last day they were seen. A later examination revealed several specks of blue paint stuck to the tape that bound the bodies. Investigators sent the paint specks to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis. A forensic chemist determined that they were consistent with auto paint. The challenge was to match them to a specific make and model. Using infrared light, the examiner established the chemical composition of the paint. This chemical signature was fed into a computer database containing similar information from every auto make, model, and color dating back to 1934. The results gave the Arkansas investigators their first lead.
So we thought that the vehicle that the bodies were transported in possibly was blue. It was determined a particular blue color, metallic blue. The FBI even narrowed it down that it was a General Motors vehicle.
Investigators reasoned that they were looking for at least 2 perpetrators. One must have driven the blue car with the bodies in it to the water, while the other followed in the Mueller's Jeep. By the time they dumped the bodies, the Muellers were probably already dead, suffocated by the plastic bags. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms from Little Rock, Arkansas was called in. ATF agent Glenn Jordan headed the case.
Our jurisdiction lay in the fact that Mueller was a former federal firearms licensee, that his firearms were missing, and the fact that Mr. Mueller and his family had been murdered.
The ATF had a complete record of Mueller's gun inventory before he forfeited his federal license. With no reports of gun sales since then, agents figured the missing weapons had been stolen.
Our goal was to enter the serial numbers of those firearms into the National Crime Information Computer in case those firearms turned up later. That would give us a lead to follow in the investigation.
Jordan was already familiar with Bill Mueller's name since the family had been the victims of a theft 1 year earlier. At the time of that robbery, Mueller reported $40,000 worth of merchandise stolen, including 5 firearms and ammunition. Since the Muellers had been victims of a robbery and homicide within the same year, agents believed that the family had been targeted by a group who used and sold stolen weapons, perhaps members of an anti-government militia.
Come on in, fellas.
Investigators returned to inspect the Muellers' belongings. After the family had disappeared, relatives had taken most of their valuable items. The landlord stored the remaining possessions in his garage. They found a Colt .45 gun case labeled with a serial number, but the gun was missing. They also found a picture of the family with some friends. The ATF entered the serial number of the Colt .45 into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center. They got a hit. The handgun had been traced to a man named Travis Brake. He had been arrested 5 months earlier in Seattle, Washington for carrying a concealed weapon. Because the gun he was carrying was now linked to another crime, Brake was arrested again by the Seattle police, this time for possession of a stolen weapon. Jordan and Duval flew to Washington State to question him.
Mr. Brake was interviewed and advised the Seattle Police Department that he had purchased this handgun at a gun show in Seattle, Washington, and he described 2 individuals that he had purchased the firearm from, one in particularly that he remembered.
Investigators showed him the photograph found among the Mueller's possessions. Brake identified one of the men who sold him the gun.
That's him, right here. That's him.
His name was Keith Collins. Agents asked Bill and Nancy Mueller's friends if they had ever heard of him. Collins had once been close with the Muellers. They had attended gun shows together. Investigators discovered that Keith Collins' real name was Kirby Kehoe. The ATF learned that Kirby Kehoe had an extensive record for firearms violations. Kehoe was also actively involved in the white supremacist movement. Members of this growing faction are strongly anti-government, heavily armed, and considered dangerous. Kirby Kehoe became a prime suspect in the Mueller triple homicide. Investigators needed more evidence before they moved in for an arrest. Almost a year after the triple murder and robbery of Bill, Nancy, and Sarah Mueller, investigators were still hunting for the killers, believed to be militant white supremacists. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, 11 months after the crime, a trooper noticed a blue Chevy Suburban parked in a handicapped space. He found a young couple sleeping inside. The man said his name was Sean Haynes. He and his pregnant girlfriend had pulled over to rest for a while. From the bumper stickers on his truck, the trooper believed he was a white supremacist. He asked Haynes if he was carrying any weapons. Haynes showed him 2 guns in the back of his vehicle. The trooper called in the serial numbers and discovered they had been stolen. One, an AR-15 rifle, had been taken from the Mueller's house in Arkansas. Haynes was arrested. Alerted that one of Mueller's guns had turned up in South Dakota, investigators from Arkansas went there to interview Haynes. Haynes revealed that he had traded another firearm for the AR-15 rifle at a Washington State motel 6 months earlier.
Can you explain how they got there?
The name of the man he swapped with was Chevy Kehoe, Kirby Kehoe's eldest son. Now Chevy was also connected to the Mueller murders. Investigators weren't through with Haynes, though. They took a paint sample from his blue Suburban. They determined that the sample did not match the paint found on the duct tape wrapped around the Muellers. Haynes had nothing more to offer. The investigation turned to Chevy Kehoe, but he was nowhere to be found. Several weeks later, Ohio State Highway Patrol Officer Harold Harker had a routine assignment: to catch speeders in the small town of Wilmington, not far from Cincinnati. While observing traffic, he noticed a blue Chevy Suburban going slower than the speed limit. Harker, a 25-year veteran who was now retired, recalled how he thought the people inside were acting strangely as they drove by.
As it approached, I saw it did not have a front license plate, and as it passed me, the driver didn't acknowledge my presence in any way, didn't look at the patrol car, just kept both hands on the wheel, fixed straight ahead. However, the passenger not only looked at me as he went by, he actually turned in the seat and looked out the rear window to watch me.
Harker knew that Washington State required vehicles to have license plates on both front and back. He called in the plate number and followed the Suburban while waiting for his dispatcher to come back with some information.
And they returned and told me that the plate apparently did match the vehicle, however it was expired. So at that point I made the determination that once we got into Wilmington where the berms were wider, I would initiate a traffic stop there.
Harker's car was equipped with a video camera mounted on the dashboard. A microphone was fastened to Harker's shirt. Harker asked the passenger and driver for ID. While talking to the men, Harker became more troubled. Neither had any ID. The driver was speaking in a very animated fashion, while the passenger looked straight ahead.
At this point, I was concerned enough with my safety and so on. I wanted to get the people away from the vehicle, and I wanted to here again get them separated, get the driver into my car, so that I'm a little more in control of their actions.
Let's sit back here with me a second, sir.
The driver eventually followed Harker to his patrol car.
You say you borrowed the vehicle? You say you borrowed the vehicle?
It's actually what I'll tell you what the process is.
Okay.
When the officer tried to frisk him, the driver quickly stepped back and became defensive.
And he actually moved away from me and used the terminology, "I don't want to be violated like that." In 25 years of criminal patrol operations, I had never had anyone use that particular terminology. And that, coupled with the appearance of the two young men, the fact that they had close-cropped military-style haircuts, very clean cut, and the driver had a Marine Corps type cover, I felt comfortable that I was probably dealing with militia personnel at that point.
Across the highway, a fellow officer, Deputy Sheriff Robert Gates, saw Harker talking with the driver and turned around to assist him. This was a common practice, since officers often worked alone in rural sections of the state.
His whole purpose is to monitor the entire situation. He doesn't get involved with answering questions, giving direction. That's my job. His job is purely to watch and observe.
The men told him they were looking for work on construction sites. Harker told the driver that if he or his passenger could not provide identification, their vehicle would be confiscated. The driver attempted to escape. As both officers tried to apprehend him, the passenger jumped from the vehicle and started firing. The passenger fled the scene while Harker tried to stop the driver. His arm became caught in the door, but he managed to free himself. The other suspect escaped into the woods. Gates pursued him. He feared an ambush among the dense trees, so he turned around. Harker, back at his car with a shot-out tire, called for help. Within moments, the rest of the Wilmington, Ohio Police Department was notified about the shootout. Officer Robert Martin heard the bulletin and then observed a Suburban in an electrical supply company parking lot. He called in his location as he went to investigate.
Only 10-6 with that suspect vehicle behind the building supply.
The Suburban's driver opened fire. Another policeman arrived to assist him. The suspect had disappeared into the industrial area. He'd shot 32 rounds. One wounded a bystander. Back at the first shootout site, investigators were trying to piece together what happened and to learn the shooters' identities. Using metal detectors, they searched for shell casings. The entire area was meticulously photographed and all evidence collected. The small town of Wilmington had never seen anything like this. Police mobilized a manhunt for the two armed suspects. The search continued into the night. Reinforcements were brought in from neighboring counties. Police knew the suspects would resort to violence in order to escape. They had to find them before anyone was killed. The suspects in the shootout were still at large. The ATF and Ohio State Police examined the second gunfight location in the Chevy Suburban. The entire crime scene was processed for fingerprints in hopes of determining the shooter's identity. Inside the vehicle were assault rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, military supplies, and medical packs. Investigators traced the munitions through receipts supplied by the manufacturers. Much of the ammo and gun parts belonged to the murdered Arkansas gun dealer, William Mueller. The extent of the military supplies suggested the shooters were violent members of an anti-government group. Ohio investigators notified the FBI. FBI agent Bill Hargraves from the Cincinnati field office spearheaded the investigation.
The case became a domestic terrorism case, basically because of the items that were found in the Suburban. They had numerous weapons, ammunition, law enforcement, clothing and equipment, law enforcement identification.
Yes, this is Trooper Herman with Ohio State Police.
Ohio State troopers traced the Suburban's registration to a man named Jacob Settle from Spokane, Washington. On the day of the shootout, Settle told the trooper he was with friends in Washington State, more than 2,000 miles from Ohio. He also claimed that he had sold the vehicle to a man named Chevy Kehoe. It would take several days for authorities to corroborate Settle's story. Ohio State troopers compared a copy of Settle's driver's license photo against images of the fugitives caught on tape. The picture didn't match. The videotape was their best clue. Ohio State Police released the tape nationwide to try to find the shooters' identities. The shootout video made primetime news around the country and produced the break investigators needed. A Washington State TV reporter recognized the driver as a white supremacist she had interviewed several years earlier for the TV show Hard Copy. His name was Chevy Kehoe. Several cops and residents confirmed the identification. Back in Arkansas, Pope County investigators working on the Mueller triple homicide also watched the video. For the first time, they saw Chevy Kehoe. They assisted Ohio State and federal investigators in the manhunt, since Chevy was also a suspect in the Arkansas murders. Duval and Jordan traveled to Ohio to meet with FBI agent Hargraves to share information. They told Hargraves that the killers used a blue General Motors vehicle to transport the victims. Hargraves thought the connection was strong, since the truck abandoned after the shootout was a blue Chevy Suburban, and more of Mueller's property was found inside. The team agreed that if paint scrapings from the Suburban matched the blue paint specks found on the victims, they would have forensic evidence tying Chevy Kehoe to the Arkansas crimes. At the FBI lab in Washington, D.C., examiners determined that the paint specks did not match the sample found in Arkansas. FBI agent Jim Shenandoah was called in, a specialist in tracking domestic terrorists like Chevy Kehoe.
We found out that they had engaged in militia-type activities, that they had anti-government views. They were very anti-law enforcement at the time. So it really heightened the security in terms of what these suspects were going to do next.
Seeking more information on Chevy Kehoe, a Washington State trooper interviewed his father, Kirby, at his home in Colesville. The trooper asked him if he recognized the men in the video. Kirby did not identify his son Chevy, but he said the second man was his younger son, Shane.
We found this unusual because the video made it fairly easily to identify the driver, who was Chevy, but not quite as easy to identify Shane. We thought that perhaps there might have been some favoritism for one son over the other.
The FBI looked into the background of 23-year-old Chevy and 21-year-old Shane Kehoe.
Chevy Kehoe was linked to a variety of crimes. In addition to the 3 murders in Arkansas, he was linked to a murder in Washington State and a murder in, we believe, in Idaho. He also committed a series of burglaries, robberies, and extortions, and also interstate transportation of stolen property.
APBs were issued for the Kehoe brothers. On February 18th, investigators picked up the Kehoe's trail in Frankfort, Ohio, 45 miles from the shootout site in Wilmington. A Chevy Monte Carlo was found abandoned in a grocery store parking lot. It had been reported stolen a mile from where the shootout occurred. Authorities suspected that at least one of the Kehoes had stolen it to escape the manhunt. The keys were all the robber had left. Investigators feared the desperate brothers would stop at nothing to escape custody. State police fanned out to canvass the area, hoping someone may have seen one of the fugitives. A mile away at the Lake Hill campground, the Kehoe's path re-emerged. Investigators learned that the pair had camped there with their families in an RV. But authorities arrived too late. Just 2 days earlier, the motorhome had pulled out. No one knew if the brothers were on board. The FBI released a nationwide APB for the vehicle. As the weeks passed, people reported sightings of the RV. They had also seen women and children in the camper. Each time authorities responded, the camper was gone. The Kehoe's trail heated up again 150 miles away in Indianapolis, Indiana, where another stolen vehicle was recovered. Inside, investigators found clothing and a gas receipt signed by Chevy Kehoe, but no trace of his brother Shane. The van had been stolen 13 miles from where Chevy fled the blue Suburban after firing on Ohio officers. The Kehoes were still one step ahead. The trail of plundered cars signaled that the Kehoe's crime spree would not cease until authorities stopped them.
There it is. We felt early on that if confronted again by law enforcement, that there would be a great probability that there would be another shooting involved and that innocent people would be hurt.
Across the country, local and federal investigators were put on high alert. They needed to find the Kehoe brothers before they struck again. In Arizona, a state trooper came upon an RV that fit the description of the Kehoe's camper. It had no license plates, and its shades were drawn. He called in reinforcements. He knew the brothers were armed and dangerous and would shoot to kill. Within moments, a SWAT team surrounded the RV. They hoped the nighttime assault would catch the Kehoes off guard and lessen the chances of another armed confrontation. An Arizona SWAT team was on the move to catch the Kehoe brothers, armed fugitives wanted in 2 states for murder and attempted murder.
Freeze!
They thought they had them cornered. It was the wrong RV. Several days later, a Wyoming highway patrolman found the Kehoe's mobile home broken down and abandoned on a desolate stretch of road. The FBI was informed and asked that the RV be towed into town for inspection. The Wyoming State Police obtained a warrant and documented its contents. This vehicle, like the Suburban, held a large cache of ammunition, guns, several fake FBI jackets, and U.S. Marshals badges. One discovery stopped the officers in their tracks.
Hey, come take a look at this.
A box of explosive components, including batteries used to detonate bombs. Fearing a booby trap, the troopers called in the ATF bomb squad. Nearby business and government offices were evacuated. Inch by inch, the bomb squad probed the RV. A thorough investigation revealed no live devices. But the danger wasn't over. According to ATF agent Jordan, the Kehoe brothers had a well-equipped bomb factory, which increased their potential for violence.
The bomb-making components that we found consisted of some metal cylinders, several types of chemicals, mixing bowls, hot plate coffee filters, instructions for making homemade blasting caps, quite an assortment of bomb-making components.
Receipts on board revealed the family's path since leaving Ohio. They traveled through West Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Texas, and Montana before ditching the mobile home in Wyoming. The vehicle offered few clues to the Kehoe's current location.
All we knew was that Chevy was last known to be in Indianapolis, where the stolen van was recovered. We presumed that Shane and the families had made it as far as Casper, where the camper had broken down. From that point on, we basically had a cold trail.
To entice the public's help, the FBI and ATF announced that they had joined to offer a reward for the pair's arrest and conviction.
The fact that it was a serious matter involving law enforcement, the fact that they had some affiliation to supremacy groups, and the fact that they were dangerous individuals, we were able to obtain a $60,000 reward for their apprehension.
More than 100 tips came in. The local leads were handled by the Ohio State Police, while the FBI and ATF pursued those from out of state. On June 16th, investigators got the news they were hoping for. A sheriff in Stevens County, Washington, received a call from a friend of Cheyne Kehoe. Shane wanted to turn himself in. The 21-year-old surrendered to the authorities and informed them where he and his brother had been for the last few months. After the Wilmington shootout, Shane had stolen a car and returned to the campground. There he gathered his and his brother's families and drove to Wyoming, where he met Chevy. Soon after the Kehoes were reunited, the RV broke down. Chevy told investigators that he and his brother had finally found refuge with their families on a remote ranch in rural southern Utah. A farmer and his wife had taken them in and offered them room and board in exchange for doing work on the ranch. Soon the situation began to deteriorate. Chevy couldn't control his explosive temper. Both Shane and his wife, Tana, grew concerned. Chevy talked of building his own white supremacist order. He thought of killing his wife, Karina, because of Native American ancestry in her family. He even talked of murdering his own parents, Kirby and Gloria, in order to raise his 6 younger brothers with his beliefs. On June 12th, almost 4 months after the shootouts in Ohio, Chevy finally turned his growing paranoia on his own brother.
Shane explained to us that they had recently gotten into a fight and that he feared for his life as well as the lives of his family.
Shane also told investigators that Chevy had several items in his possession that belonged to the Muellers. Chevy had also admitted to suffocating the Mueller family. Not knowing what Chevy would do next, Shane and his family fled Utah in the middle of the night, driving almost 1,000 miles back to Washington State. Authorities inspected the truck Shane drove, looking for additional evidence. Lab examiners discovered that the vehicle, which belonged to Chevy Kehoe, had been repainted from its original blue color. FBI forensic chemist Ron Mentold explains.
We often see repainted vehicles in the laboratory here, and we can determine how it was originally painted. The layers of paint can many times be thought of as a stack of cards that is loosely adhered to each other. Okay, and any one card can be withdrawn from the layer and sampled individually. So the ace of diamonds, which is a primer layer, would be different in chemistry and color from the king of spades, which would be on top.
The test results were conclusive. The composition of the blue paint found on the Kehoe's vehicle matched the specs found on the Mueller's bodies. The evidence against Chevy Kehoe was compelling, but capturing him would be no easy task. Investigators would have to travel to Chevy's remote hideout in Utah, where an arrest team could be seen approaching from miles away. Wanted for triple homicide in Arkansas and attempted murder in Ohio, the white supremacist Chevy Kehoe was heavily armed and hiding with his family on an isolated ranch. Apprehending the criminal in the wide open spaces of southern Utah would be dangerous for agents and Chevy's family. The FBI and ATF needed an arrest plan that minimized the risk. Agent Will Long was in charge of coordinating the plan. He is in shadow in order to protect the sensitive nature of his current case.
Chevy's children and his wife were there, and we certainly didn't want to get involved in a situation where they were in the middle of a shooting situation or possible hostage situation.
Long enlisted the help of Rodney Levitt, the farmer on whose land the brothers had been living. Levitt agreed to help the FBI due to his concern for Chevy's children.
He told us that on a regular basis, Chevy Kehoe would, at his request, travel into Cedar City to run errands for him related to the farming operation. And in this case, they had previously talked about Chevy coming into town on this day to pick up some feed from the local feed store. And we decided that we could use that as an opportunity to take him at the feed store in an environment that we could control.
That left agents only 2 hours to get into position before Chevy arrived in town with Levitt.
2 hours is a short amount of time. We placed surveillance units along the road that would be in a position to call out the location of Chevy Kehoe and Mr. Levitt as they made their way into town.
The plan was working perfectly until Chevy Kehoe made an unscheduled stop. The FBI didn't know if Kehoe was onto them and was making a run for it. The agent on location radioed in for assistance. He waited for instructions to apprehend Kehoe or get Levitt to safety. For a few breathless moments, no one knew what would happen next. Chevy returned to the truck with a soda. To the undercover agent, it seemed that Chevy had no suspicions and returned to the road. Back in town, more than 25 agents waited for the arrival of Chevy and Levitt. Snipers were positioned on the rooftops, and the feed store was surrounded. Agents were also located in the nearby neighborhood. Their objective was to prevent Chevy from escaping and taking hostages. While Agent Long loaded hay in front of the feed store, his plan nearly went awry.
As we were listening to the radio, we heard one of the surveillance units call out that Chevy had crossed a landmark that was approximately 1 minute away from the feed store.
At that very moment, the farmer unwittingly pulled into the parking spot the FBI was holding for Chevy. Agent Long had a split second to act.
Sir,
I ran across the parking lot with my badge and credentials in my hand. I told this man that a dangerous fugitive was about to pull into the parking lot and that we were going to arrest him right here, and that he needed to immediately get in his vehicle and get out of the parking lot.
The farmer complied, and Long returned to his position. Seconds later, Chevy Kehoe pulled into the parking lot.
FBI, get on the ground! Get down on the ground! Get down on the ground!
Long and his team pounced on the suspected murderer, leaving him no time to reach for a concealed weapon. After 5 months of a nationwide manhunt, the FBI had finally captured Chevy Kehoe. Back at the ranch, there was still the matter of taking Chevy's wife, Karina, and their 3 kids into custody. Once again, Levitt offered his help.
Apparently, Mr. Levitt had an injured back, and Karina would routinely come out and open the gate for Mr. Levitt to let him into the property as a courtesy to him because of his injury.
To open the gate, Karina had to leave the house, giving agents the opportunity to arrest her. Long hid in the back of the truck with 2 other agents.
Just as we anticipated, Karina came out and opened the gate, and as she was looking at the gate and concentrating on manipulating the latch, we jumped out of the back of the truck and immediately searched her and found a loaded 9mm pistol in her back pocket.
Get down on the ground, ma'am. Get down on the ground. Get down on the ground. Spread your legs. Spread your arms.
Long obtained a search warrant for the Kehoe's trailer on the Levitt property.
Okay.
Before inspecting it, the FBI safely escorted the children outside and entrusted them to the farmer. Back inside, Long discovered a well-stocked armory. Chevy Kehoe, anticipating a siege, had stationed loaded guns at every window. With both brothers finally in custody, the pair was transported back east to face 16 state and local charges. Chevy would first be tried in Arkansas on federal charges. With the Kehoes locked up, U.S. Attorney Paula Casey had several months to prepare a solid case.
The federal agents in Aaron Duvall, Jay Winters, came here and they laid out the evidence they had of all the various crimes that had been committed. And after we examined everything that was there was sort of this growing realization as we reviewed these things that it was a racketeering case.
Placing Chevy's illegal activities under a racketeering umbrella, Casey needed to demonstrate that crimes were committed in order to expand his white supremacist movement.
The racketeering statute lets us give a jury the complete picture of what happened. It lets us put that together so that all of the evidence can be placed before the jury for their decision.
Chevy Kehoe was ultimately charged with 57 federal crimes, including the brutal murder of Bill and Nancy and their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah.
Chevy Kehoe was tried, and following a 3-month jury trial, he was found guilty of racketeering, and as a result of his conviction, he received a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, because in the federal system there is no parole.
As for Brother Shane, despite his claims of self-defense, he was found guilty of the state charges brought against him. Among them, attempted murder for the shootout in Wilmington. He is currently serving 24.5 years.
The reason I think every agency was so cooperative in working on this was just that it was a horrible crime. It was a crime that was obviously hard for anybody to figure out why it happened, exactly how it would happen. It was just one of those things that everybody wanted to help out, and they knew that we couldn't do it all ourselves, and if it had been their case, they wouldn't have been able to do it by themselves either. So it was just a matter of everybody getting together, because the bottom line was there were some bad people out there, and everybody just needed to get involved for a common cause, and that was to put the bad guy behind bars.
In Washington, D.C., crime had become epidemic. Gangs fought over drug turf, leaving corpses in their wake. The Metropolitan Police Force was overwhelmed as the homicide rate climbed to over 400 per year. Before officers could stem the tide of violence, they became the targets. A cop killer was on the loose, and police turned to the FBI to stop him.
In 1995, our nation's capital was also our nation's murder capital. Even the police weren't safe. While Washington, D.C. law enforcement targeted criminals, the criminals targeted law enforcement, even gunning down officers on patrol. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. As the death toll mounted, D.C. police called upon the FBI for help. The hunt was on to find a cop killer and to bring order to a town in trouble. But things would only get worse before they got better.
On January 10th, 1995, at a fast food restaurant in northwest Washington, D.C., Metropolitan Police Officer Vance Warren was taking a dinner break while working part-time security. It had become common practice for businesses to hire uniformed off-duty police officers to protect their establishments. Everyone felt more secure, customers and employees alike. No one inside saw the dark figure retreat into the shadows. 2 bullets grazed the back of the officer's neck. He peered out into the darkness looking for the shooter, then radioed for assistance.
We got shots fired.
He didn't know where the shots came from, or if the gunman was still out there, waiting to strike again. Responding officers raced to the scene, but the gunman was nowhere in sight. There was no attempt at a robbery. It appeared the shooter's sole purpose was to kill the officer. From witness accounts, police believe the shooter acted alone. The forensic team recovered 2 .32 caliber slugs from inside the restaurant. No shell casings were found at the scene. Though Officer Vance Warren survived the shooting with only minor injuries, others weren't so lucky. Less than 2 months earlier, on November 22nd, a gang member walked into the District of Columbia's police headquarters with a gun and began firing. In an instant, the police sergeant and 2 federal agents were dead. The 4th was critically wounded. With no chance for escape, the killer turned the gun on himself. Police couldn't help but suspect the shootings were somehow connected, even though there was no evidence linking the attack on Officer Warren to the shooting at police headquarters. The attempted murder of the officer seemed like one more incident in an escalating war over drugs and turf. Metropolitan Police were overwhelmed with the level of violence and the crushing caseloads. With at least 1 murder occurring each day, homicide detectives couldn't keep up. For Detective Loren Ledman and his colleagues, their city was under siege.
We rode the wave of the crack epidemic that came in. It paid a heavy toll on our citizens in the murder rate. We had a serious amount of cases. We had a lot of violence. We escalated to the position of being, per capita, one of the worst in the nation.
It was about to get even worse. On January 17th, a few blocks from the White House, Metropolitan Police Officer Eric Hayes was in his patrol car. A taxicab double parked on the opposite side of the street. While the officer filled out paperwork, a man approached his cruiser. He shot the patrolman 4 times at close range. Wounded in his chest, legs, and abdomen, Officer Hayes struggled out of his vehicle. The cab driver witnessed the shooting. He reported it to his dispatcher.
Look, just sunset running down the alleyway.
As the shooter bolted, the cab driver circled around the block. Making his getaway, the gunman stripped off his mask and jacket in an attempt to change his appearance. When the cabbie turned the corner onto the next block, he saw the shooter emerge and alerted his dispatcher that the shooter hailed him. Not realizing the cabbie had witnessed the shooting and followed him, the assailant got in. The driver discreetly turned off his radio, and the dispatcher notified police.
Keep straight, man, keep straight.
An APB was issued for taxi number 440. The driver tried to remain calm, hoping police would find his car. Within minutes, cops picked up the taxi's trailer. The gunman barked a new address and told him to keep driving. In an instant, the driver slammed on the brakes. The assailant discarded his gun and ran. He evaded the pursuing officers. Police retrieved the weapon, which held 6 used shell casings, and called for backup to search the area. At the crime scene, Officer Hayes fought for his life. He survived emergency surgery where doctors removed 4 .32 caliber slugs. An officer called in a forensics unit to gather evidence. They scoured the crime scene. Before gathering any physical material, they photographed the entire area. In the alley, they found the clothing discarded by the assailant, including a black ski mask. They hoped clues revealed in the lab could lead to the shooter's identity. Fearing another blindside attack, the police chief ordered all officers to patrol with a partner and called in the FBI for assistance. Special Agent Jay Abbott was assigned the case.
That what had happened up to that point led us to believe that, my God, we may be dealing with some sort of gang in D.C. that's just decided to take it upon themselves to declare war on the police and just start trying to kill police.
Metropolitan Police fought back with forensics. They sent all physical evidence gathered from the crime scenes to the FBI laboratory, one of the foremost forensics labs in the world. Clothing recovered from the most recent shooting was forwarded to the Hair and Fiber Unit. This unit works 2,500 cases a year from around the country. The DC cop shooting case was given top priority. After the clothes were scraped over a clean sheet of white paper, the surface was inspected carefully for artifacts. An examiner discovered a single head hair from the ski mask. When a suspect emerged, a sample of his hair would be compared to the one found. A match would be vital in a successful prosecution. The gun, the casings, and the recovered slugs were sent to the FBI's Firearms and Tool Marks Unit. Agents needed to determine if the .32 caliber revolver left by the assailant was the weapon used to shoot the officers. Every gun possesses distinct spiral grooves inside its barrel. When a bullet is fired, those grooves leave an imprint on the projectile. The grooves from a fresh bullet would be compared to the grooves on the recovered slugs to see if they corresponded. The bullet sample, together with the slugs, were forwarded to an analyst for scrutiny under the comparison microscope. The bullets matched. This confirmed that the .32 caliber revolver was the weapon used in the two most recent shootings. Investigators were now looking for one man. To find their suspect, the FBI and Metropolitan Police called on their only eyewitness, the cab driver. They asked him to provide a description of the assailant to a police sketch artist. The cabbie described an African-American man with a medium complexion and square jaw. The most distinguishing feature he remembered was that the gunman wore braces on his teeth. Investigators contacted area dentists and orthodontists to see if they recognized the man in the picture as one of their patients. The composite was also distributed through television, newspapers, and local business. A reward prompted hundreds of phone calls. Special Agent Jerry Bammel helped work the leads.
Based on leads which we generated, telephone calls which we received, possible identifications from the dentists and orthodontists, we identified approximately 100 individuals who could have been suspects in this shooting of the police officers.
Investigators worked around the clock to narrow the field of suspects.
We were working 7 days a week on this case because it had a certain urgency to it, given the fact that a subject was stalking police officers and attempting to kill them.
Over several months, suspects were interviewed and eliminated one by one. Agents and detectives made no arrests. Thousands of investigative man-hours had led nowhere. Then, on April 26th, Officer John Novobilski of the Prince George's County, Maryland Police was hired to guard a liquor store in nearby Landover, a suburb of the District of Columbia. A masked gunman approached and fired at close range. He unloaded 16 rounds. The policeman never had a chance. Then he took the downed officer's 9mm pistol. From a nearby corner, a witness heard the shooting and called for help. But it would come too late. Officer Novobilski died instantly. Maryland police secured the area and interviewed the witness. There was no apparent motive, no warning, and the victim was a cop. The pattern seemed to match the two shootings in Washington.
There was tremendous similarities between the killing of Sergeant John Novobilski and the wounding of our two police officers here in Washington, D.C., in that an individual walked up to a seated police officer and without provocation opened fire and shot the officer.
5 months had passed since the first officer was shot. Agents were no closer to finding their suspect, and now he was wanted for murder. Washington police and FBI agents scoured the streets looking for the assailant who had wounded two of their colleagues. As they continued to hunt, Maryland police made an arrest for the murder of their officer. There was no evidence linking the Maryland suspect to the two attacks on D.C. police. Special Agent Jay Abbott believed the D.C. attacker was still at large and could strike again at any moment.
But we felt this person was probably going to try to kill another police officer somewhere in Washington, D.C. or in the vicinity. And it gave us real pause for concern that we weren't able to follow up any viable leads during that time.
On May 18, 1995, while investigators continued their search in Washington, a young Maryland woman arrived at a Prince George's County precinct. Bruised and battered, Nadine McCrae explained to the police officer that she had been beaten by her boyfriend. Accompanied by a supportive friend, Nadine began to detail the vicious assault she received at the hand of Ralph McClain.
So 9 o'clock last night.
Agent Bammel recalls its severity.
McClain tried to kill McCrae the evening of the 17th, which was the reason that she came forth to the police on the 18th. He beat her into unconsciousness. He stuffed drugs into her.
Information I need from you.
The Prince George's County police officer issued an arrest warrant charging McClain with attempted murder. He recommended that Nadine get a thorough medical examination. On the way out, Nadine's friend pleaded with her to tell the officer the reason McClain had almost beaten her to death. Nadine hesitated.
It's okay.
She was afraid of what else McClain might do if she said anything more. Reluctantly, she told the police officer what she knew. The night the sketch of the suspect appeared on the television news 3 months before, she was surprised to see McClain prying the braces off his teeth. When she questioned him, McClain screamed at her to mind her own business. According to Nadine, her boyfriend, Ralph McClain, was not only responsible for the shootings in Washington, he was also a cop killer.
Her boyfriend had advised her that they had the wrong person for the shooting that occurred in Landover, Maryland with Officer Novobilski.
She provided the break that agents were looking for.
Okay, Nadine, I'm going to call another detective who's handling this.
Nadine McCrae, so reluctant to speak at first, knew that now there was no going back.
I think she realized how dangerous the person was and was very willing to cooperate with us. Because I think at that point she also realized that her own life was in danger now, having revealed her knowledge of the subject.
Agents entered Ralph McClain's name into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center, to find out if their suspect had any prior convictions. For Agent Bammel, the database revealed that McClain was no stranger to crime.
He had a long history of criminal activity here in Washington, D.C., totaling over 20 arrests. Those arrests were for some petty crimes, shoplifting, but they did escalate to assault on police officer, drug distribution type charges also.
Investigators secured a search warrant for McClain's apartment.
It was a very tense time just to go into that residence with the possibility that he could be there and with all the tension of realizing what they might find.
McClain wasn't home. Investigators began searching the apartment. Survivalist magazines, weapons manuals, and how-to guides for terrorist operations were strewn everywhere. The materials detailed how to conduct surveillance, conceal movements, and catch victims by surprise.
Detective.
In the living room, the forensic team uncovered a black ski mask similar to the one found at the second shooting.
Yeah, that fits the description too.
They also discovered 9mm cartridges, the same type used in the assault that killed the Maryland officer. In a cabinet, they found more ammunition, this time for a .32 caliber weapon.
That's very important to us because the shooter of Sergeant Eric Hayes and Officer Vance Warren used a .32 caliber revolver in that shooting. Also, a manual for a Mac-11 assault weapon was found, and additionally, lots of writings of anti-police type hatred were found within the residence.
Forensics examiners searched for strands of hair to compare to the one found previously. The team took samples from hairbrushes, bed sheets, even the drain in the bathroom sink. If hairs from McClane's apartment matched the hair recovered from the crime scene, agents would have forensic evidence against the fugitive.
There's more in here. Let me get the rest of this out.
Armed with a photograph of a suspect, detectives called on the cab driver. They asked him to look at a photo lineup to see if he could identify McClane as the man who shot Officer Hayes. Metropolitan Police Detective Lauren Ledman was there for the lineup.
The cab driver had always told us that if you ever, show me a picture of the guy, I will recognize him. You hear that, right? But I mean, he said it with a lot of passion.
Investigators handed photos to the witness one at a time. He studied each carefully. When he was handed the fourth photo, the whole terrifying incident came flooding back. He was staring into the face of Ralph McClane.
He was talking to the picture as if Ralph McClane was there. He was talking to him through the picture. It was the best identification I've ever seen. I mean, he's screaming at this picture.
Investigators now had two witnesses who pointed to Ralph McClane as the cop killer. Science would be the third witness. At the FBI labs, examiners matched the hair samples retrieved from McClane's apartment to the hair recovered earlier from the clothing found at the Officer Hayes shooting. It was the critical piece investigators needed to secure an arrest warrant for Ralph McClane.
At that point, we were armed with some very serious evidence. We had the girlfriend with the admission, we had hairs, and we drafted an affidavit for signature for a Superior Court judge, and in the middle of the night, we went out and we obtained that warrant.
But first, they had to find McClane. Investigators canvassed all of his known haunts. The suspected cop killer had apparently fled the area, and agents had no idea where he was headed. Ralph McClane was wanted for shooting 3 police officers in and around Washington, D.C., killing 1. A month had passed since the last shooting, and investigators had no clues to his whereabouts. To find him, they looked to his girlfriend, Nadine, for help. She was under constant police protection since McClane had tried to kill her. Nadine spoke with McClane through his cell phone. He was not aware that investigators were listening.
You want to meet?
Through their conversation, Special Agent Jay Abbott and his team were able to track McClane's movements.
We were able to locate him at one point in the Fredericksburg, Virginia area, and we're very close to making an arrest at that time. But unfortunately, he was able to evade our attempts.
Their conversations continued over 2 more days. Authorities learned that McClane was traveling south to Florida, but he never gave Nadine a specific location. Investigators wondered if McLean knew his girlfriend was cooperating with police. She told them that he monitored the news constantly on a portable TV. If they were going to catch McLean, they needed to surprise him and keep his name out of the media. That meant keeping the arrest warrant out of the national system. In South Carolina, that decision would work against them when a highway patrolman pulled him over for a moving violation. The officer approached and asked to see a driver's license and vehicle registration. McLean showed him his registration and claimed his license was in the trunk. The South Carolina officer, just weeks away from retirement, followed him to the rear of the automobile. McLean rifled through his belongings and pulled out his license. The officer told McLean to return to his vehicle while he called in to see if he had any outstanding moving violations. He also checked to see if the car had been reported stolen. Records indicated that it was legally registered to Ralph McLean. He issued McLean a ticket, then gave him directions to the town's magistrate's office to pay the fine. The officer survived the incident, but authorities had missed an opportunity to capture the cop killer. Back in Washington, Detective Lauren Ledman looked for a way to lure him back to the area.
We were faced with somebody that was mentally unstable, that was out actively shooting police officers. We were kind of at his mercy because he was calling the shots. And the key was is we needed to get him nailed down in the location where we could surround him.
Investigators once again depended on Nadine's help. They advised her to promise McLean a reconciliation if he returned.
Hey, you want to meet somewhere?
McLean said he was interested in the offer, though he wouldn't agree to when or where they would meet again. Investigators worried that they were losing the element of surprise.
We were looking for a little bit of an edge, but that edge was taken away from us. The media found out about it. They broadcast his name, his photograph, and so forth, which really bothered us because it brought us to another heightened level.
They hoped McLean hadn't seen the broadcast. On Memorial Day weekend, McLean called Nadine. He was ready to meet with her. As instructed by the FBI, Nadine suggested meeting at a large shopping mall in Northern Virginia, a place where agents could maintain surveillance without being noticed.
What I'll do is I'll call you when I get to the mall.
McLean agreed to the location. The information was relayed to agents in Washington. Special Agent Al Buckley, in charge of the arrest plan, was notified. He called the FBI SWAT team that had been on standby for several days.
When I heard the information that Mr. McLean was heading back to the Virginia or Washington, D.C. area, I felt that Mr. McLean was coming up to do two things, either to kill Nadine and possibly kill an additional police officer.
Agents and D.C. officers arrived at the mall in Tysons Corner, Virginia. Their first task was to set up a perimeter. They had to be certain that once McLean arrived, he would not slip through. Collectively, the team had decades of experience. This should have been a routine operation.
I've been involved in several arrest situations where meetings are held before the arrests, and a lot of times there's a lot of joking around just to relieve the tension. I'd have to say that that night was a little bit different. It was quiet, and that's probably the first time in my FBI career that I could just cut the silence with a knife.
The team finalized plans and waited for word that McClain arrived. At the Prince George's County Police Station, where Nadine kept in contact with McClain, the dispatcher relayed information to agents in the field. Agent Buckley got the call. McClain had changed the rendezvous location. The fugitive wanted to meet Nadine in Maryland, nearly 25 miles away from where the SWAT team had assembled. The sudden change of plans was troubling. The call suggested that McClain might have known he was being set up. Wanted cop killer Ralph McClain was on his way to a Greenbelt, Maryland plaza to confront his girlfriend, Nadine. An FBI SWAT team was racing there to intercept him. Since McClain had changed the location from Tyson's Corner, Virginia, investigators suspected the armed fugitive knew Nadine was cooperating with authorities. Special Agent Jay Abbott was gravely concerned.
At the time, we began to sense that he had suspicions of what was happening. And given those suspicions, that added to the sense of urgency even more. We weren't sure that he would actually show up at one of these locations to meet Nadine. He might begin to smell that there was a trap.
As they got closer, agents turned off their blue light and constantly monitored the radio. A police dispatcher relayed updates to agents in the field. He kept them posted on McClain's plans, learned through conversations with Nadine.
36 and 51, be 1051 to 600 block of Jefferson.
Agents were at the mercy of the fugitive's whims. After changing the location several times, the team got word that McClain decided to meet at a gas station across from Beltway Plaza. They scrambled to set up a perimeter around the gas station. Agents hoped they would have enough time to secure the area. Once in place, they would wait for McClain to either show up or call Nadine. Detective Ledman took his position in a field across from the gas station. He believed McClain would show up to see Nadine despite suspicions of a trap.
We didn't even know if he even really wanted to meet her. We just felt that he was just trying to get in shooting range of her to kill her. Why? Because she was the only ear witness to this shooting of this police officer.
As the team continued to assemble, Nadine remained at police headquarters on the cell phone with McClain. Securing the closest position to the gas station, 20-year veteran agent Billy Christian arrived. The schoolyard across the street offered the best vantage point. If McClain appeared, Agent Christian would be the first to see him.
Is this number one? Is this number two?
Other team members set up on nearby streets, hoping to spot McClain's car as it approached. Pressure mounted as they waited and watched.
It was very tense. Al Buckley and I were sitting in a vehicle together just a couple hundred yards away, trying to direct the activity of a number of people. And it was very tense. I remember saying to him when we were in the car, I just hope that we can get him without anybody getting hurt.
Finally, the team was notified that the suspect had called Nadine. He complained that he didn't see her at the gas station. McClain was in the area, but agents couldn't get a precise fix. Investigators believed he was very close.
this particular time, he was whispering, which led me to believe that somebody was close to him, which caused me to look around. You see, was I on top of him and didn't know it?
Hidden behind a small hill, Detective Ledman checked the gas station again. But he still didn't see McClain. Scanning to his right, the detective could see Christian's car. From his position, Christian also surveyed the area, but he too saw no trace of the fugitive. At that point, a local officer out on his regular patrol approached Christian's car from behind. The patrolman, unaware of the arrest plan, thought the agent's car seemed suspicious.
Bill Christian, to his credit, realized and recognized the danger that the officer was in and exited his vehicle, walked to the vehicle, and showed him his credentials. That action probably identified Bill Christian to Ralph McClain as a law enforcement person.
The officer turned off his lights and pulled away from the scene. Christian resumed his surveillance. While investigators watched for McClain, he was watching them. The element of surprise and the tactical advantage was McClain's. Well camouflaged in dark clothes, he surveyed the car where Agent Christian sat waiting and watching. He advanced slowly and deliberately on Christian's position. Agents knew he was out there, somewhere. Anxieties ran high since McClain's calls to Nadine had stopped. The cop killer continued to advance. With Christian's gaze fixed on the gas station, McClain stalked the agent. FBI agents and DC detectives surrounded a gas station in Greenbelt, Maryland, waiting for cop killer Ralph McClain to show himself. The arrest team knew he was close, but they didn't know where. McClain was advancing on Agent Billy Christian from the shadows. Christian heard something, turned to look, but saw nothing. He heard it again, glanced around, but no one was there. McClain's low profile hid him below the agent's line of sight. The killer continued to advance on his unsuspecting prey. Rising just beyond the agent's line of sight, McClain lifted his Mac 11 machine gun and aimed it at Christian. Muzzle bursts ripped through the night air. Agent Billy Christian slumped in his seat. Detective Ledman spotted McClain sprinting into the woods and called for backup. The detective pulled the bleeding agent from the car, laid him flat, and made a second call for assistance. Agents Jay Abbott and Al Buckley were among the first to respond.
We heard a call come over the radio of shots fired and that the subject is running. When we pulled up on Billy Christian's car, we realized that Billy had been shot. The window had been blown out.
Detective Ledman tried to help the fallen agent before rescue units arrived.
He had been hit on the blind side to his left at a 45-degree angle. He had been hit several times, and he was dead.
The cop killer had claimed another life.
This person had just killed a colleague, not just a colleague, but a good friend, a mentor to some of us. He had been around for a long time, a 20-year agent. And to have this happen was enraging.
Units from several jurisdictions responded instantly. A Prince George's County officer arrived with a police dog and started to hunt for McClain in the dark.
I remember him running up to Billy's car. I remember him looking at Billy and sniffing at the door area and then turning around and trying to make a beeline back toward the school.
The team tore off into the darkness with the dog and their semi-automatic weapons. They didn't know if they were walking into another trap.
We started into the wooded area. I had my flashlight out, and I remember just clicking on my flashlight on and off, because at that point I was afraid that if I kept the beam on, that Mr. McClain would be able to focus in on either one of us.
The darkness worked in McClain's favor.
We went into the woods in an attempt to at least try to locate which way he went or where he went. And it was probably an error in judgment to do that when I look at it in retrospect, but that's how high the emotions were at the time.
The team pressed on, but McClain had enough of a lead to plan a deception.
As he ran away from the scene after just shooting Bill Christian, he had the wherewithal to call 911 and report that he saw a man with a gun leaving the area in a vehicle. This was an obvious attempt to try to throw those of us who were in pursuit in another direction to try to aid in his escape.
Tracing the call, agents knew he was still in the area, but they didn't know exactly where. It appeared the fugitive cop killer had evaded authorities once again. He ran through the parking lot of the nearby plaza. The team was infuriated by the senseless murder of Billy Christian. They steeled themselves to continue the pursuit. Agents and local investigators alike vowed to stop the cop killer before he killed again.
Anger was probably the biggest feeling that I had that night. Frustration. I was frustrated that we're all not going home tonight. Billy has to stay here.
As agents Buckley and Abbott continued to track the fugitive's path through the woods, Detective Ledman received a call from investigators positioned in the parking lot of the plaza.
Mr. McClain had run and gotten behind a store and had a large ramp that leads up to the back of the store where there was 3 trailers, and he had secluded himself behind those.
McClain opened fire on pursuing officers. They took cover on the ground and returned fire. Emerging from the woods, agents Abbott and Buckley saw officers being fired upon. They pulled their guns and joined in the fight. McClain was dug in and well armed. Officers were pinned down. No one knew how to get to him without losing another life. FBI SWAT team member Jerry Babel arrived on the scene. He aimed at the fugitive, but didn't have a clear shot. He saw an opportunity to flank McClane and maneuvered to his right. While police and agents traded fire with the cop killer, Bammel remained hidden from McClane. Then he stepped out from behind the dumpster and began firing on the shooter from the opposite side. From his position, Bammel noticed that McClane had a possible escape route.
The loading dock ended with a railing and then a 10-foot drop wall. And I realized that McClane could conceivably get over that wall and flee into the lower parking area where there were no agents or officers at the time.
Bammel blocked McClane's exit with gunfire. Now McClane was receiving fire from two different positions. He swung around and sprayed rounds where Bammel was standing. The agent returned fire. McClane was hit. Agents and officers continued firing. McClane fired one more round. Then there was silence.
I waited a moment, and then there was a call out, something like, "He's down, he's down."
Bammel hesitated before advancing on McClane's position to be sure this wasn't another trick. While officers and agents waited in the lot with guns at the ready, Agent Bammel made his way alongside the trailer, approaching the motionless figure. Another agent advanced on the opposite side. As they moved in, an officer yelled from the darkness that he saw movement. He was going to fire two more rounds towards McClane.
As soon as he yelled that, I yelled, "Don't shoot, don't shoot, don't shoot," because I was immediately concerned of the fact that we had placed ourselves into a deadly crossfire situation.
It was over. McClane had shot himself with a 9mm pistol, the same weapon he had taken from Officer Novobilski, who he murdered a month earlier. The cop killer was dead, but the price was steep.
This person, the subject, had one goal in mind, in my opinion, and that was to kill police officers. And why, I will never know, but it was apparent to me that that was what he had decided to do for whatever reason at some point in his life.
Agent Billy Christian was close to retirement when he was gunned down. He had worked with Agent Bammel over the span of his long career.
Billy had been a 20-year agent with the FBI. Billy was an expert marksman, a firearms instructor, one of the first members of the FBI's hostage rescue team, the full-time Special Weapons and Tactics team, and he was also a member of the Washington Field SWAT team.
The names of Agent William Christian and Officer John Novobilski were added to the Law Enforcement Memorial, commemorating those who have fallen in the line of duty.
My desk here at the FBI overlooks the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial, and not a day goes by that I don't think of my friends.
Their sacrifice remains vivid and is recalled each Memorial Day.
There is a feeling when you lose a brother or sister, agent and officer, that a part of you is lost, and they will never be forgotten.
A serial killer was on the loose in western New York. He chose his victims for the color of their skin. The community was gripped by fear, not knowing when or where he would strike next. The only evidence he left behind was spent shell casings. To focus their search, local authorities called on an FBI profiler for help. They needed to stop his murderous rampage before the killer ended another life.
Buffalo, New York, a sniper targeted African-American men. He held a city hostage and threatened to ignite a racial powder keg. And it looked like others might be following his bloody example. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. When it became clear that physical evidence alone wasn't enough to corner the killer, FBI profilers developed other means. Their work provided the only hope of flushing him out and connecting him to his crimes.
On September 22nd, 1980, in Buffalo, New York, Larry Robinson drove up to a supermarket with Glenn Dunn. Dunn promised to wait while Robinson went in to cash his paycheck. While he waited, Dunn decided to step out of the car for a cigarette. At about 9:45 p.m., psychiatric nurse Madonna Gorney just finished her shift. On her way home, she decided to pick up some groceries. Not far from where she parked, Gorney spotted Dunn fidgeting in the shadows. She was alone and felt unsafe. There had been robberies in the area, and Gorney did not want to be another victim. She headed straight for the lit entrance, where she passed another man who appeared to be waiting for a ride. Gorney felt safer once inside. Larry Robinson had only a short wait in line to collect his money. Looking for his ride, he noticed Dunn's car parked at the end of the building. When Robinson tried to get in, the door was locked. Dunn did not respond. Robinson came around to the driver's side and discovered Dunn was not moving. He was bleeding from the head. Robinson ran back into the store to summon help. When Madonna Gorney left the store, she noticed commotion at the end of the building and asked if she could be of any help. The security guard replied that it wasn't necessary. The situation was under control. With 3 bullet wounds to his head, Dunn was in critical condition. Paramedics struggled to save the young victim. His heart had stopped. Efforts to revive him were futile. He was pronounced dead on arrival. When police informed Dunn's family, they discovered he was only 14 years old. A forensics team searched for clues to the killer's identity. Fingerprints lifted from the car belonged to Dunn and Robinson. The blood was confirmed as Dunn's. The only trace left by the assailant was spent bullet casings. They had been fired from a .22 caliber weapon. A check of the car's license plates revealed it had been stolen the night before from a local dealer. Police questioned Robinson. He told them that he only knew Dunn casually from the neighborhood and did not know the car had been stolen. Robinson said he'd been walking to the supermarket earlier in the evening when Dunn drove up and offered a ride. Friends and family would later confirm that he and Dunn barely knew each other.
I'm here at the top supermarket.
The crime was already making news. As the story broke, Madonna Gorney returned home from the supermarket, still troubled by the incident.
But they did confirm that he is a 14-year-old local resident.
Gorney was upset to learn that a young boy had been killed in the parking lot. She decided to call police the next morning to see if she could be of any help. Buffalo homicide detective John Regan initially thought the slaying might be a result of a car theft ring.
Exploring where the stolen car had come from and the people that may have been responsible for it, it became apparent that this was not the focal point of the investigation.
To develop leads, police canvassed nearby residents, hoping someone may have witnessed the shooting. A uniformed officer found a witness willing to cooperate and called a detective to question her.
What we got?
Barbara Wozniak lived next door to the supermarket. She told the detectives that she had heard the gunfire and seen the assailant.
Well, we just start from the beginning.
At around 9:45 on the previous evening, she was cooking when she heard 3 pop-like sounds. She hurried to her window to see what had caused the noises. She saw a white man running from a parked car. He wore a hooded sweatshirt that obscured his face.
Anything else, anything you forgot?
While the detective spoke to Wozniak, he was informed that a witness from the supermarket had called offering her help. It was psychiatric nurse Madonna Gorney.
The real reason I called was because a 14-year-old kid had been killed in that car the night before, and all I could think of at the time was, I'm a mother. If somebody killed my kid, I would really want to know who it was.
Gorney recounted what she had seen that night at the supermarket, hoping it would be of some help.
When I pulled in, I noticed a man standing under the lamppost near the edge of the parking lot. When I got out of the car, I purposely walked farther away from him, with the idea that, yeah, I was alone, it was dark. If he was standing there, he was probably up to no good, and I didn't want to be part of it.
Anxious, Gorney looked for other people who might be of assistance if she were to become a victim of crime.
My first reaction was, wow, there is somebody else out here. As I walked closer to the door and was able to get a better look at him, I thought to myself, if something does happen, he's not going to be of any help to me, because basically he had a very dazed or very dopey look on his face, and I wasn't impressed.
She described him as a slender white man with dark hair who held a brown paper bag on his lap. He wore metal-rimmed glasses and a hooded sweatshirt which shadowed his features. The description seemed promising since the previous witness had described a similar man running from the scene. Detectives hoped that Gorney could provide details for a sketch. After talking to Gorney, Buffalo detectives got word of a similar shooting in the nearby suburb of Cheektowaga. The victim, 32-year-old Harold Green, was rushed into emergency surgery as detectives arrived at the hospital. His situation was critical after being shot in the left side of the head with .22 caliber slugs. Detectives found his wife in the waiting room and asked what she knew of the shooting. Her husband had stopped at a fast food restaurant. He was sitting in his car eating his lunch when a hooded white assailant walked up and shot him. When an employee heard the gunfire and saw the shooter sprint from the scene with a brown paper bag, she called her manager. The method of this attack resembled the one from the night before. Detectives speculated that there was a possible connection between the two victims. Mrs. Green said neither she nor her husband knew Glenn Dunn or his family. Her husband was a successful engineer and a pillar in his community. He moved in different circles than the teenage car thief. Investigators found the two victims shared nothing in common. Green died without regaining consciousness. Only one piece of evidence linked both shootings. Lieutenant Thomas Rowan of the Cheektowaga Police Department led the forensic investigation.
We had our first piece of hard physical evidence that connected the shooting in Cheektowaga at the fast food restaurant, the shooting which took place in Buffalo, New York. That single fact that tied everything together was spent cartridge casings from a .22 caliber. At that point, it was only identified as a firearm because we didn't know what type of firearm had produced the spent shell casing.
That same night, homicide detectives were summoned to another shooting. It was the third attack on an African-American man in less than 36 hours. 31-year-old Emmanuel Thomas had been killed while crossing a residential intersection. From eyewitness accounts, the investigators pieced together the chain of events. An hour earlier, Frenchie Cook left the home of his friend Emmanuel Thomas. Thomas, a freelance house painter, told his wife he was going to the store and would be right back.
Be careful.
Neighbor Thomas Jackson saw the two friends walk by and head for the corner of East Ferry and Zenner Streets. As Thomas and Cook crossed the intersection, the killer struck from out of the darkness. With a gun concealed in a paper bag, he shot Thomas several times in the left side of the head. Thomas collapsed to the pavement. Frenchie Cook was in shock. He never saw the assailant approach. He did not know anyone that would want Emmanuel Thomas dead. A teenage witness who saw the shooting from across the street described the suspect as a hooded white male, around 5'8" or 5'9". The forensic team retrieved .22 caliber shells resembling those found from the previous shootings. They were sent to the lab for comparison. Detectives had little else to go on.
In this particular case, we had two common denominators. We had black men and we had a .22 caliber weapon that was used to kill them. Other than that, there were no connections between the victims, either collectively or even singly, and no connection with a shooter.
Startled investigators came to the realization that Buffalo had a serial killer on the loose. Police had no leads and only one apparent motive. Assistant District Attorney John DeFranks was called in to monitor the case.
We uncovered no evidence that there was a robbery motive. We uncovered no evidence that this was a situation involving bad blood between the attacker and the victim. What we had was an assassin randomly shooting people on the basis of race.
With the identity of the racist assassin unknown, the press dubbed him the .22 caliber killer. He was already on the prowl for his next victim. The .22 caliber killer was preying on African-American men in Buffalo, New York, killing 3 in 36 hours and leaving little evidence behind. Emmanuel Thomas had been the killer's latest victim, gunned down crossing the street in front of his home. Medical examiners performed an autopsy. They found powder burns near the entry wounds. This meant that the muzzle of the murder weapon was placed close to his temple. From the pattern and severity of the burns, examiners believed they were caused by a sawed-off rifle. They removed 2 mangled .22 caliber slugs from his head and sent them to the ballistics lab for analysis. As investigators searched for answers, community fear turned into anger. Erie County District Attorney Ed Cosgrove was in charge of coordinating the hunt.
The black community demanded action by the police. And of course, because of the nature of the attacks and because of the psychotic nature of the person ultimately responsible, it wasn't going to be an easy task.
The next day, on September 24th, Joseph McCoy walked down a residential street in Niagara Falls, 20 miles north of Buffalo. In front of a church, the 43-year-old man was ambushed and killed. A witness described the shooter as a slender white man dressed in khakis. Once again, police found nothing but .22 caliber shells at the scene. The shells, along with the slugs extracted from the victim, were sent to the Erie County Department of Central Police Services to compare to the others. Lieutenant Thomas Rowan conducted the ballistics analysis.
In this case, it presented a rather difficult challenge to the firearms examiners and to law enforcement, is that the bullets themselves, as it went into the body, they broke up, they disintegrated, and broke into tiny little pieces, making specific identification of the weapon from the bullets inside of the victims very difficult, not impossible for the firearms examiners.
The shell casings could tell them more. Every gun leaves specific marks on a shell when it fires. The firing pin, ejector, and extractor from a weapon make impressions on the casings. For examiners, this is the gun's fingerprint. They found that the markings on the casings from the 4 crime scenes all matched.
The relationship of the firing pin impression, the ejector, and the extractor marks suggested fairly early on that a specific type of weapon was used, and that was a Ruger Model 1022.
The 4th shooting sent more shockwaves through the black community, and investigators still had no suspect. Local officials had no answers. They called on the FBI for assistance. Special Agent Chip Mrazowitz realized the case had the greatest urgency for the community.
It was important for the FBI to get involved in this case because there were African Americans being killed in the area, and everybody was scared to walk the streets, daytime and nighttime.
A composite sketch was rendered by an FBI artist who worked with several witnesses that had gotten glimpses of the killer. The sketch was circulated through patrols, newspapers, and television. Police also carried the sketch door to door, hoping that someone would recognize the suspect. When thousands of calls began to pour in, Detective Regan realized the composite did little to focus the investigation.
Basically, the composite sketch was like Everyman. As a result of it being published, I think we got somewhere around in the neighborhood of 6,000 calls that had to be checked out. And one of the fears really is that you may actually get the suspect, and because you've done so many of these, it becomes routine and you don't pay attention. That's the ultimate fear, that you go right by the man.
While local investigators tracked down leads in the Buffalo area, FBI agents pursued those outside of Erie County. Leads were followed in Pennsylvania, Ohio, all of New England, and across the border in Canada.
To have that many leads, we were occupied 24 hours a day. We were looking for one lone white male who possibly could be walking next to you in a street or having lunch with you at some cafeteria, and you don't know if you had the .22 caliber killer next to you.
On October 8, 1980, workers on a construction site in the Buffalo suburb of Amherst came across an abandoned taxi on the service road of the New York Thruway. When no one returned to move it, they contacted the state police. The trooper who responded inspected the empty cab. found a wallet under the front seat that held a driver's license but no money. It belonged to 71-year-old Parler W. Edwards, an African-American cab driver. The keys were missing, and Edwards was nowhere in sight. The trooper decided to search the trunk, but found it locked.
No keys?
Nothing.
Using a crowbar, he forced it open. He found the missing driver.
Parler Edwards was literally bludgeoned to death in a parking lot in the town of Cheektowaga. We found pieces of his skull, parts of his mouth, teeth that had been knocked out, a great deal of blood.
Before throwing Edwards' body into the trunk, the killer had also cut open the driver's chest and removed his heart. It wasn't clear that the Edwards slaying was connected to the others, since a .22 caliber rifle was not used.
The fact that he was a black male certainly raised suspicion in the minds of the investigators. Said, could the killer have now progressed to mutilation of the body in this case?
No one knew for sure. Perhaps it was an isolated incident perpetrated by a copycat killer. Manpower dedicated to the murders swelled to 150 personnel from various agencies. The hotline rang 24 hours a day. No calls led to a suspect. With community pressure mounting, the frustration grew for Special Agent Richard Ferri.
In this case, we had several crimes occurring. We had no evidence to indicate who that person was responsible. And for an investigator, it was extremely difficult for us to accept the fact that we could not find anything that could identify this person positively.
Early on October 9th, a water worker was driving towards a dock area in the town of Tonawanda, just a few miles from Buffalo. On the edge of the road, he spotted a man laying face down near the tall grass. The worker approached and saw that the man wasn't breathing. He immediately called authorities. They arrived within minutes. Investigators identified the victim as 41-year-old Ernest Jones. Like Edwards, Jones was a taxi driver who had his throat slashed and heart cut out before his body was moved to a remote location. He was the 6th African-American male to be murdered in the Buffalo area in less than 3 weeks. Authorities were baffled. With little evidence to guide them, they weren't sure if one person was responsible for all 6 homicides. Only one aspect linked the first 4 shootings with the deaths of the 2 cabbies.
Basically what you have is the 4 shootings which are definitely linked. You have the 2 cab drivers who are linked to each other, but not necessarily to this. There's controversy even within the police, within teams of investigators as to whether or not they're connected.
Agents and local authorities had no way of knowing if there were 1 or 2 serial killers out there killing black men. By October 9th, 1980, 6 African-American men had been found slain in the Buffalo area. Authorities were not certain that only one person was responsible. In just 3 weeks, the serial killings had split the local community along racial lines. District Attorney Edward Cosgrove led the investigation.
It's hard to even describe the community mind at that time. There were demands for action all over from the black community for the police to stop what was happening here. I had press conferences that were attended by the national press. Everybody descended upon Buffalo, and everybody wanted answers from me. I didn't have the answers.
The story made national headlines. a $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the .22 caliber killer. President Jimmy Carter took notice. With the wedge of civil rights violations dividing the Buffalo community, the president declared the investigation a federal case. Local lawmen now had the full resources of the FBI at their disposal. As federal agents began sifting through the collected information, another incident rocked upstate New York. On the night of October 10th, Colin Cole slept in Buffalo General Hospital. Cole was an inmate from a local jail, recuperating from a drug overdose. Just as visiting hours were coming to a close, a man walked down the hall of the 7th floor looking for Cole's room. The recovering addict gasped for breath as the man tightened the ligature. A nurse administering medication surprised the strangler. He fled, leaving Cole alive. The nurse alerted hospital security. But the call came too late. It was the 7th attack on a black man in just 3 weeks. No one knew for sure if the .22 caliber killer was responsible for this attack.
What we have is this crime scene.
Lieutenant Thomas Rowan and his team had little understanding of serial killers at the time.
Glimpsing into the mind of a serial killer is like twinkling your toes into the abyss of the very weird. You're never really sure what's there.
Local investigators needed someone who was more familiar with these types of offenders. They called upon John Douglas of the FBI Behavioral Sciences Unit to provide a profile of the .22 caliber killer. Through this process, Douglas would provide the team with insight to the killer's psychological behavior. Currently senior analyst of appbnews.com, an online crime news website, Douglas spent 20 years pioneering the science of profiling.
A profile is designed to come up with the most probable offender. Its goal is to eliminate a lot of false leads. An attempt is being made as well to maybe refocus the investigation of law enforcement or possibly reinforce the investigation by telling them that you're on the right track here.
Douglas was on the next plane to Buffalo. During the trip, he familiarized himself with the case files.
You have to walk in the shoes of both the subject and walk in the shoes of that victim to truly understand really what took place during that assault. I'm going to be asking myself the question, why? Why this victim?
He confirmed what local investigators believed. The only connections among the 6 murder victims were their race and sex. They were black men who had been chosen by at least one killer as targets of opportunity. The strangled survivor, Colin Cole, was not a random victim since he had been sought out in his hospital room. The profiler believed Cole's attacker was at the very least a racist copycat, not necessarily responsible for any of the murders. Douglas needed to probe further. He had to meticulously recreate each murder from the known evidence. Reviewing all 6 attacks, the profiler looked for behavioral characteristics that could be ascribed to just one offender.
When you look at serial killers, you look at patterns as well as signature. Signature is something that the offender does. It's kind of repetitive behavior, but behavior that the subject has to do. It's more of a ritual.
Douglas found the behavior from each of the 4 shootings to be similar. The .22 caliber killer had surprised random victims, fired quickly from close range, then bolted, leaving his prey before they were dead. The assassin's signature was a blitz style of attack. The cabbie murders didn't seem to fit that pattern. In those 2 cases, the killer had severely bludgeoned the victims, mutilated them, then dumped them far from where they were killed. The killer had spent a great deal of time with the bodies, even after death. To Douglas, this suggested two different killers.
There are different types of serial killer. They're the very personal types of serial killers and the impersonal style and type of serial killer. The personal type of an offender wants to look in the eyes of the victim, and they want to spend hours, if at all possible, with their victims, be in a position of total control and domination. That's what really is going to turn them on.
It appeared the cabbies were murdered by a personal type of serial killer. Those crimes demonstrated a rage and overkill that were not evident in the shootings. Douglas believed that the psychopathology of the .22 caliber killer left a seemingly different behavioral thumbprint.
And the assassination style of serial killer are somewhere in an age group between 25 to 28 is when they first begin to surface. And how they could be described as really even more of an asocial type of personality, not so much antisocial, but asocial, keeping to themselves. They generally become obsessed with weapons. They may be found with having multiple weapons as well. The person would probably, if he was in the military, I said that he'd have difficulty in any branch of the service and would probably, at some point, would even receive a discharge.
To the profiler, it looked as if Western New York may have had two distinct serial killers on the loose. Douglas reported his findings to local investigators. Because the technique of profiling was new in 1980, a few had doubts about its reliability.
Some people look at this as this is some type of voodoo or witchcraft. I mean, how are you able to determine, for example, age of the offender? And actually, it's pretty easy once you do enough of these cases.
From his experience with similar cases, the profiler added that the .22 caliber killer would most likely be an avid hunter, having a history of menial jobs. Douglas stressed that it was up to the local team to find or eliminate suspects based on his profile.
This is a good tool, but really it's you. You're the people up there, you police, you're going to solve the case. I'm not going to solve the case. To me, this is the easy part. I'm just going to try to help you maybe refocus the case, give you an idea, paint a portrait of the offender, but really you're the one who's going to knock on the doors and wear out the leather soles and come up with the suspect.
A national all-points bulletin of the .22 caliber killer's profile was received by law enforcement agencies around the country. Investigators had a description, but still had no name. Late in 1980, the FBI and local police searched for leads in the unsolved murders of 6 black men from Western New York. Hoping to focus the massive investigation, an FBI profiler was called in to assess connections between the cases. He believed it was possible that 2 distinct racist killers were responsible. 2,000 suspects were interrogated, but police made no arrests. Buffalo wasn't the only city in New York State facing terror in the streets. 400 miles southeast, in New York City, a knife-wielding attacker was terrorizing Midtown. Commuter Ivan Frazier was the victim of a subway knifing 3 days before Christmas. Blocking the attack with his arm, he survived and reported the assault to the NYPD. At 1:25 in the afternoon, Ivan Frazier noticed another rider talking with an attractive woman. To Frazier, it appeared the man was trying to pick her up. The woman seemed annoyed. He got up to exit at the next stop. Frazier returned to his article. Without warning, the man across the aisle slashed Frazier in the forearm and wrist, then dashed away. He described the assailant as a white man in his early 30s with brown hair, wearing a blue jacket. 2 hours later, at 3:30 in the afternoon, 19-year-old Luis Rodriguez was walking on the west side of Midtown Manhattan when he was jumped by a white man demanding his wallet.
crazy?
Rodriguez fought off the initial blow, but the attacker lunged at him again, stabbing him twice in the chest. Before he died, Rodriguez described him to police as a white man with brown hair, wearing a blue jacket. 3 hours after Rodriguez, Antoine Davis was found stabbed to death in front of a Midtown bank. By 10:35 p.m., Richard Renner died in front of a hotel on 49th Street. He was also stabbed. By 11 p.m., the killer was back on the subway looking for another victim. He spotted Carl Ramsey. In the dim light, no one noticed the knife. Bleeding severely, Ramsey crawled out of the subway. By midnight, he was dead. In less than 24 hours, 4 black men were dead. The New York City press dubbed the killer the Midtown Slasher. The rash of attacks on black men in Manhattan had many similarities to the profile of the .22 caliber killer. New York City investigators called on John Douglas to provide a profile of the slasher.
Because I did an independent analysis, and when I started to paint a portrait of that person, my goodness, it was just like the Buffalo, New York case as well. We have a subject here approaching his victims, blitz style of attack.
There was one major difference. The Midtown Slasher used a knife. The .22 caliber killer used a rifle.
Now, we don't have the 22 weapon, but maybe the reason for that is we don't have the 22 weapon because now we're dealing in areas that are very highly populated. If you have a 22 weapon, the sound of this would draw attention to himself.
Douglas determined that the signature behavior was identical. With a gun or a knife, the assailant attacked in the same way. By late December, District Attorney Cosgrove realized something else that bolstered the profiler's conclusion.
During that period of time, there had not been any assaults here in the city of Buffalo. It was quiet with respect to the activity of this .22 caliber assailant.
By the early weeks of 1981, the killer seemed to have disappeared. In January of 1981, the FBI and local investigators searched for the .22 caliber killer, wanted for the murders of at least 8 black men in New York City and Buffalo. Following months of investigation, Buffalo detective John Regan and his team were unable to come up with the name of a viable suspect.
The case is in limbo and everybody is frustrated. They don't know where to go. We don't have a name. We have no idea. Then out of the blue, there's a call made to the Buffalo Police Department homicide.
An officer from the Army's Criminal Investigative Division in Fort Benning, Georgia, made the call. The Army was holding a 25-year-old Private Joseph Christopher on charges of assaulting a fellow soldier. On January 13th, 1981, Private Christopher attempted to stab an African-American enlistee. While he was in custody, Christopher tried to castrate himself with a razor. When Captain Dorothy Anderson began administering medical aid to the prisoner, he began muttering that he'd killed black men in the New York and Buffalo area. He didn't know the exact number of his victims. It was just something he had to do. Troubled by his story, Anderson reported it to the Army's Criminal Investigative Division. She told the CID officer of Christopher's ramblings. The CID officer remembered receiving an APB on the New York killings. He called the Buffalo Police Homicide Division as instructed by the teletype. For District Attorney Cosgrove, this explained why the killings had stopped in New York State.
From the time of our discovery of the second cab driver's gruesome death until almost Christmas of 1980, when we had the killings, the 4 killings in New York City, there had been a cessation of attacks, and apparently that was when Joseph Christopher was in the Army down in Georgia, as we later found out.
The FBI and the police finally had a name: Joseph Gerard Christopher. Agent Mrazowitz and his team compared Joseph Christopher's background to the .22 caliber killer profile.
He was pretty accurate. He described him as a white male, but early 30s, a loner. Possibly, if he were in the military, he would be hospitalized. He would be seeking psychiatric care. Prior to being in the military, he would have had menial type labor. As soon as you had the name Joseph Gerard Christopher, you knew that that profile matched.
Investigators tracked down several friends and acquaintances of Christopher's.
Detective Lobbin, talk to you a moment.
David Robinson had been a friend of the suspect for over a decade.
You familiar with a gentleman named Joseph Christopher?
They often shot target practice and went deer hunting together at Christopher's family cabin. He also told investigators that Christopher had a gun collection that his father had left him when he died. The collection included a .22 Ruger rifle, but Robinson never saw one that was cut down. Investigators secured a search warrant for Christopher's last known residence. They arrived at his mother's house in Buffalo, New York on April 22nd, 1981. In Christopher's bedroom, FBI agents recovered metal-rimmed glasses and khaki clothing that matched witness accounts of the perpetrator's apparel. The FBI profile drawn up by John Douglas predicted the .22 caliber killer would be fascinated by guns and the military. The Christopher basement was an underground firing range. Agents found the inherited gun collection and portions of a sawed-off gun barrel. Among the paraphernalia, forensic specialists found boxes of .22 ammunition, a misfired .22 caliber cartridge, along with a rotary magazine. Ballistics specialist Thomas Rowan believed the evidence was significant.
Finding the rotary magazine for the 10/22 Ruger was an important feature that supported a widely held theory throughout the investigation that the shooter specifically picked something so he could keep the profile of the weapon low enough to fit inside of a paper bag when he conducted these executions of these men on the street.
The rotary magazine enabled Christopher to have a full load of ammunition and allowed the sawed-off weapon to remain concealed in a bag without having to reload. A second warrant allowed investigators to search the family cabin in Ellington, New York. Detectives dug in the spot where Robinson told them he and Christopher shot rifles. The excavation yielded 2 shells, marred with a unique firing pin mark. The same marking was on the shells collected at the crime scenes. Firearms specialists of the Erie County Department of Central Police Services examined the shell casings that were found at the Christopher home and cabin. They compared them to the casings found at the first 4 crime scenes. They concluded that the shells were all fired from the same gun. With this match, Assistant District Attorney John DeFranks was able to get an indictment from a grand jury.
The casings spoke for themselves. Put the casing under the microscope, you had your evidence. It couldn't be altered or tainted.
Joseph Christopher was extradited from Georgia and returned to Buffalo, New York to stand trial. Officers fitted Christopher with a ski mask to prevent witnesses from identifying him through the media.
We put a mask on him for purposes of preventing potential witnesses from observing his face on the television and then basing their identification on that rather than upon their own recollection.
All right, thank you, Ms. Gorney, for coming down.
One of those key
I have the
witnesses
lineup of
was Madonna
people
Gorney.
to take a look at.
She had seen the .22 caliber killer the first night he struck in the parking lot of the supermarket.
Top store.
On May 5th, 1981, she confronted Joseph Christopher in a lineup.
It was a little scary. I was concerned with the possibility of being actually anyone in the lineup being able to see us who were there to identify someone in the lineup.
Gorney was protected by the bright lights that shone in the eyes of the subjects. She was able to identify Christopher in 2 different lineups. Agents and local police felt certain that they had the .22 caliber killer. Questions of Christopher's mental competency delayed the trial. In December 1981, a judge pronounced Joseph Christopher mentally incompetent to stand trial. He was committed to the Mid-Hudson State Psychiatric Center where he received treatment. On February 17, 1982, Christopher was deemed fit for prosecution. The trial began on April 6, 1982. The community watched every step the prosecution took.
The media reported this entire case on a day-to-day basis, sometimes on a minute-by-minute basis. It was good for the community because they wanted answers, they wanted information. And it was good for us because it began to convince the community that we had the right individual and that their fears could be somewhat allayed.
The state jury found Joseph Christopher guilty for the murders of Glenn Dunn, Harold Green, and Emmanuel Thomas. He was sentenced to 60 years to life imprisonment. Prosecutors never tried him for the Manhattan knifings. One question still remained. Was Christopher also the taxicab slasher? Though the FBI profile excluded Christopher as the suspect, he later revealed details of the cab driver's wounds that only the killer could have known.
We wanted to make sure here in Buffalo and Erie County that we satisfied the community's need for professionalism, thoroughness, competence, and all the other things that the community expects of its policemen and prosecutors. And we were able to satisfy that need because we were successful.
Through science and good detective work, Joseph Christopher would never be free to kill again. He spent the rest of his life behind bars until his death, curiously from a rare form of male breast cancer at the age of 37.